So, formally welcoming everybody to the fourth webinar in the series of launch webinars around the book that Jack and I wrote, Rebuild the Economy, Leadership and You. The scheduled time for this webinar is 90 minutes. And during that 90-minute period, Jack and I will be talking for around 20 minutes after we finish this introductory preamble. And then we just open space for conversation wherever the conversation takes us. The theme for this webinar is specifically around how we think, not so much what we think, but how we think, the different patterns of thought, forms of thought that we have access to and that we use to massage and manipulate what it is that we're thinking about. So that is a big part of what Jack and I also used to write the book, are these different forms of thought. In the third webinar, the last one, and we've just put the recording of that online, we went into something that comes directly out of applying these forms of thought, namely an area where pretty much all of modern day economics and business science seriously underestimates the risk and the consequence of risk in investments and in business decisions. Basically, we're applying the statistics we were taught at school in situations where that statistical approach is simply not appropriate. And it also has quite serious consequences when we try to take decisions in our own lives. If we try to apply to our lives those statistics. But all of that is online in the video, so we won't go into more detail there. That was just a couple of pointers of where you can get more stuff from. This webinar, we're going to go deeper into the whole question of how we think. So, diving now into the content. The fundamental model that we use throughout the book Rebuild is based on something called the constructivist developmental framework. Now, like any framework, we're not saying that this is how the world actually is. We're saying that this is a useful way of slicing things, a useful set of lenses to get a better handle on what is, how we can talk about it, and how we can develop ourselves. And at the heart of this framework is that, first of all, we take in information, which is completely neutral information, maybe from our eyes, our ears, our bodily senses, our instincts, whatever it may be. We take the information in, then we go through a phase of manipulating the information, basically taking all of the bits of information as if they were pieces of a puzzle and assembling them together into a puzzle. That's a process that we name sense making. It's, can we put the stuff together in a way that makes sense? After sense making comes meaning making. That's when we take the puzzle that we've assembled, look at the picture that has formed on it after our sense-making process of putting it together, and we attribute meaning to that picture. The meaning we make might be one of, oh my good, fear, panic, terror, we have a climate catastrophe rushing in on us. Or it might be a meaning of, right, now's the time for action. What can I do? Where are the levers I can pull? It's the same picture, the same sense making, but two quite different meanings that have been made of it. And that then leads to the final part of what's woven through the entire book, the distinction between what we name reality and what we name actuality. Actuality is what actually is. It's everything. reality is our internally experienced reality that we construct through the various filters and biasing processes of what's left after we've taken stuff in, what's left then after we've chopped and changed it to put it together as a puzzle through sense making, and then how we color those pictures in, the meaning that we attribute to it. And at the end of that is where we get to what we call reality, which is our internally constructed reality. And the thing about that reality is few elements. One of them is, we have, let me see, we have 20 people on this call. There are 20 different realities live in this call. Every single one of us in the call is living in a fundamentally different reality. It may be, yours might be quite close to mine. It might be quite a long way away from mine, depending on the story templates we use to attribute meaning, to color in the puzzle, depending on how fluid we are using the different forms of thought to construct the puzzle for sense making, and of course, depending on what information we're actually taking in the first place. And this is critically important in that all too often we get into arguments with people where we think we're arguing about right or wrong, but actually we're arguing about two different realities that each of us is inhabiting or experiencing. And so it's really important to learn, how do we uncover how the other person is thinking, their sense-making processes? What are they able to use in sense-making? What are they not able to use? And vitally important, and this is a different chapter in the book, how does that person construct meaning? How do they make meaning? So that's the essence of this, diving deeper into the how we think now. Typically, we start by learning logical thinking. We learn how to use formal logic or binary logic from a very young age, and we get well trained in that at school and university. However, binary logic is simply inadequate to deal with the world we're in today. If all somebody is able to use is binary logic, then in that sense-making process, as soon as you're in some kind of uncertain, nebulous, ambiguous, complex context, binary logic leads you to chop off all of the subtleties of the puzzle pieces, leaving you with simple puzzle pieces that you just put together like bricks. For example, binary logic says that something is either true or it's false, and that those are opposites. Binary logic says, well, male and female are opposites. Post-logical thought or dialectical thought forms are using thought forms like represented in this square, where the opposite of true is simply not that true, and the opposite of false is simply not that false. So somebody who is able to use the dialectic thought forms related to this truth square can very easily accept that the opposite of a deep truth may be another equally deep truth that is simply different. So this is where, in writing the book, Jack and I used a lot of these thought forms to recognize where were we prematurely simplifying something, where were we missing something. That makes these thought forms enormously powerful and relevant for anybody in any leadership role, especially anybody trying to come up with solutions for the climate catastrophe or any of the other global challenges that we're facing. So how does it all work? There are 4 kinds of thought forms that come after formal logic. Thought forms that are around processes, movement, change. Thought forms that are around static structures, contexts, how things fit together. Thought forms that are around relationships or relatedness, how different entities are actually connected with each other. And finally, built off those three are thought forms that are around transformation. And the difference between transformation versus movement, movement is more or less predictable, whereas transformation is unpredictable. Transformation is the butterfly emerging out of a caterpillar, where the caterpillar can't extrapolate from its caterpillar being into a butterfly being. Whereas process would be the caterpillar weaving a cocoon and wrapping itself up into it. A caterpillar can imagine cocoon, but it can't extrapolate linearly into butterfly. So if we go, I'll give now a couple of examples of these thought forms. All of them are covered in detail in chapter 9 of the book. There are 28 thought forms in total, 7 in each of these categories. Chapter 9 gives an introduction to the book, to the thought forms, and both through us and through a range of other sources. You can go on coaching programs, training programs to develop your capacity in these thought forms. Something I will emphasize, as you can imagine, with the fact that these are called dialectic thought forms, the only way to really develop your capacity for dialectic thought is in dialogue with others. So reading the book will be of some help, but it won't get you all the way there. If we take the first one, process thought forms, process 3 is where you're able to fluidly recognize that everything can be composed of interpenetrating opposites. This is woven through the whole book, where we talk about complementary pairs, entities or concepts that we think of as polar opposites, but that are actually one whole, and we're better served by dealing with them as one whole. You know, and the in the investment world, things like profit and impact are often treated more or less as in opposition to each other, that you can't have really positive impact outcomes and extremely high profit. Well, we refuse to accept that. We see those as interpenetrating opposites that can make a bigger whole, a complementary pair, where yes, you can have excellent profit and excellent outcomes. Another one, process thought form 5, people who recognize that knowledge is always under construction, people who recognize that they know something now, but that tomorrow they may have changed what they know, that as they grow in experience, as new stuff comes in, what we know is continually under construction. Somebody who's not yet fluid in that thought form will think that knowledge is knowledge is knowledge is always absolute and fixed and rigid. So you can see how somebody who is very able to use these 2 examples of the 7 process thought forms will construct their puzzle out of the pieces in the sense-making process in a much more subtle, richer, and nuanced way than somebody who thinks that opposites are opposites and don't connect or interpenetrate, or somebody who thinks that knowledge is always absolute. You know, and as Jack knows, in the world of economics, for example, or in any professional discipline, there are a lot of issues because people who have expertise are often not yet sufficiently developed cognitively to recognize that knowledge is always under construction. The next one that I'll touch on is context. So whilst the process thought forms are being able to hold in your thoughts concepts about movement or entities that are moving and changing, the context thought forms are static systems thinking. And two of the ones that I find really useful, and they're fairly advanced thought forms, the sixth and the seventh context thought form. The first is using frames of reference. In other words, every time any of us judges something or evaluates something, we're always judging something as good or bad, better or worse, stronger or weaker, whatever the judgment is we're making, against some frame of reference. We're so often in arguments with people where we may actually be in complete agreement, just we're judging the same thing that we're each looking at with two different frames of reference. So again, somebody who is fluid in using the frames of reference thought form immediately recognizes both what the evaluation is they're making and the frame of reference they're using to make that evaluation. And they recognize the fact that there are multiple frames of reference that could be used. So in an argument, they will explore what is the frame of reference that somebody else is using to see if the difference is coming about because two people are just at that point using different frames of reference to evaluate something. Again, it opens up huge space for collaboration, creativity, and really making a difference in our work. And a step beyond that is recognizing a multiplicity of contexts, being able to, for example, as in the truth square you saw a moment ago, recognizing that something can be true in one context, false in another context, but that doesn't mean that that itself is true. It means that it's in the context that it has truth or not. So being able to juggle with a multiplicity of contexts, again, is a really important part of being able to fully engage in the world we're in today. Most people, as they develop beyond formal logic into dialectic thought forms or post-formal logic, begin developing the context thought forms and are the strongest usually in those. Process comes in next. And the third one that we begin to develop are the relationship thought forms. So the first one, the simplest one, is being able to recognize the existence of relatedness. So often in pure logical situations, we're dealing with situations where people don't even recognize the existence of a relationship between two entities. And I'm sure that everybody in this call can think of situations where you've been pulling your hair out, and you can see what's happened to me. You've been pulling your hair out because the person you've been talking to doesn't recognize the existence of a relationship in some context. The other one is constitutive relationships. This is the most advanced relationship thought form, which is where you recognize that the relationship pre-exists, predates the two entities that are in relationship, and that it's actually this old pre-existing relationship that is shaping the whole and each of the entities in relationship. And a classic example of that is, for example, marriage. The relationship of marriage, the institution of marriage, is ancient. In a sense, it has its roots right at the beginnings of life on Earth. And so that relationship is enormously powerful, more powerful than most people realize, in shaping the people who are in that relationship. To the extent that a friend of mine has actually named the relationship he has with his wife. And when they go to bed at night, they say good night to each other, and they say good night to the relationship, recognizing that there are actually three entities in that relationship. The final one is transformation thought forms. This, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a kind of thought form that is best illustrated by thinking of a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. It's one system transforming into a completely different system. Two of the transformation thought forms that I find very useful. One is transformation 2, the value of conflict, especially the value of conflict for development. We actually need the conflict that we're experiencing to develop out of the oil-based economy into a post-oil economy, to deal with all of the root causes of the climate catastrophe, to recognize that they can't be solved with simple solutions, but need multi-solving solutions. Conflict is essential for that, as is, for example, the capacity to use thought form 5 fluidly, which is about bringing multiple systems into balance with each other. The final thing I'll say before I hand over to Jack is what I've just gone through is one of the dimensions of what we call the size of person, which refers to how much capacity somebody has for complexity, for nebulosity, for volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity. And the more complex the world is that somebody is working in, the bigger they need to be because their size of role is bigger. Both of these can be measured and quantified. So one of the things that is becoming more and more important in business and in everything we're trying to do in today's more complex world is have a good idea of what is the size of the role that somebody is being asked to do, and either put into that role somebody that has the appropriate size of person, or have in place ways of developing their size of person so that they're at least as big as the size of role. If they're not as big as the size of the role, then they will prematurely simplify what's happening, partly because they're not able to use the thought forms we've been talking about with sufficient fluidity to grasp what actually is. And that's a big reason why Jack and I put chapter 9 into the book, is to give everybody easier access to ways of developing our own size of person and assessing the size of role so that we can get that matched and that we can do the stuff that needs doing. One of the big areas where that is not yet good enough, of course, is in economics. So I would like to invite Jack, if you could pick up at this point and say a few things about this in economics.
Oh, absolutely. And I just want to reiterate and just welcome everybody. This is a real honor for both of us to be reaching out and working with you. And actually, I think this is a good example of what we're writing about. And when we write about in the book, we don't mention, well, you know, this is the dogmatic, this is the way we see the world. We just mention that this is just a possibility. And we're reaching out and dialoguing and listening with all of you. That's what this webinar is all about. I wish I could stay the duration of this hour, but I do have to be teaching in about 15 minutes. And that means I have to really abbreviate what I would like to say. But I really think that Graham really put this into really good perspective and gave us a good big picture. And I would just like to reiterate that dialogue is very critical in this. It's difficult if you want to master any one of these just to do this on your own. But I would also add that in addition with dialogue, it's also very critical to listen. And I think that's what's missing right now in economics. This is what I'm teaching. That's where I will be teaching about 15 minutes, is the ability to dialogue and also to listen. And I think each of these are very much related to each other. And I've been arguing that, maybe what's missing in the economics curriculum, particularly at the undergraduate level and even at the graduate level, is just a basic course in listening and dialoguing and the actual way to think rather than what to think. It's interesting. When we began writing this book, I was very, very much intrigued by these thought forms. This was something new, or relatively new. Although, looking in retrospect, I realized that I was over the life I've been leading and living. I've been more or less mastering these thought forms without knowing it. And I think that's the beauty of what we're presenting is this is something that's easily digestible and something that it's given, and this is something that you could work on. In my own situation, this is something that I had to develop, and a lot of this was implicit. And after we wrote the book, I would simply say that this is my most favorite aspect of the book. And the reason being is it's both Graham and I were very, very much interested in doing something. We want to make the world better. And we want to get from A to B, realizing that right now, A is unsustainable. But in order to do this, there's a lot that we have to get done. And as even when I'm working on my lectures and preparing lectures, I'm using a lot of this particular chapter. I think it is very, very critical in everything that we do. And I would maybe offer a suggestion, given that my minutes are limited. I would simply offer a suggestion as you're reading this. You might be overwhelmed and arguing that, well, or stating that there isn't any way that I can master all of these. And this isn't the objective. The objective is to get familiar and figure out where you are and then where you can go. And I would just offer a suggestion that, as an overview, reading chapter 9, and then we also give a good map in one of the tables. Just look and ask where you are specifically. What are you doing? What do you usually do? I mean, do you relish conflict and the multiplicity of different relationships or different frames of reference? And if not, what's the reason? What is the reason? And then maybe you can look at that and dialogue with others that might be a little bit more skilled in what you're missing. And I think this is the best way of progressing. Now, I don't know if I could just limit my remarks with economics, given that if we look at each of these, I think economics is missing a lot. And this is one reason that, I basically, my life's work right now is reconceptualize the way we do economics and economics education. And one of my overall goals is to bring in each of these thought forms, and particularly the last relationships and transformation. And this is all missing. There's a lot of dogmaticism, and there's a lot of maybe reluctance to basically argue or agree that our knowledge is limited. And I do think each of these are necessary.
Great, thank you, Jack. So the final thing I would just like to put in, and then we will go into general conversation, is just to point at, do follow Jack and myself on Twitter or on LinkedIn. If you want to be on our mailing list, do sign up on the book page on my website. And when you sign up there, you also get a free copy of the PDF. Our next book discussion is on May the 25th, starting at the same time as today. And if you want to dive deeper into this stuff, we have a range of workshops up there workshops on the 28 thought forms we've just been touching on how you can incorporate as a Fair Shares Commons company. And coming up soon are our Mimpreneurs and mid-career transition programs and our Adaptive Way program that Stephanie is leading. The floor is open for discussion. I would suggest to keep this more or less managed. Click on the button to raise an electronic hand if you want to say something, and the floor is open for questions, comments, and anything you want to bring in. I've seen some conversation in the chat window. Now is space to dive deeper into that. Who would like to break the ice? Please break the ice, somebody.
Jack, I'd just like to say a big thank you for explaining. We don't need to have detailed familiarity at this stage with all the thought forms. But yeah, it's a great chapter. And I really like the sense of how, as you go through each of the different types of thought forms, they become engaging more with VUCA environments and more with that ambiguity and complexity and stuff. So, but yeah, it's a great chapter, and maybe there are 2 of them I currently use. But yeah, great, thank you.
Great, thank you, Anna. And yes, what you're pointing at is vitally important. When I analyze, for example, in a leadership meeting, what forms of thought are actually being used, it's all too often all too abysmally formal logic and very lacking in dialectic thinking, which is why so often business actions are simply not fit for purpose. The leadership team is simply not seeing what is actually happening because they lack the capacity to see. Right, I think Mila's hand was the next up. Mila. Oh, and Anna, if you could lower your hand.
Sorry. Yeah, I asked the question, can you speak to what you mean size of person? Because there's size of role and size of person.
Yes, gladly. So with size of person, in the framework we're using, the adult developmental framework, we're referring to 2 distinct axes. The one axis is somebody's category of meaning making. How inclusive and comprehensive is that category? That's one of the dimensions where people get bigger and bigger, the more they can span multiplicities of meaning. And the other category is sense making. How fluid are they in using these dialectic thought forms? So somebody who uses all 28 dialectic thought forms to their fullest extent with superb fluidity, and I'm nowhere near that level, would have the largest size of person on that axis. And somebody whose meaning making is, so in the language we're using would be, say, at Keegan stage 5 or even Keegan stage 6, is at about the highest level that you are likely to encounter in meaning making there. So they would have the largest size of person, and therefore is the kind of person who is best suited to the largest roles. And the size of role, again, is about, in a sense, how big and complex are the decisions that somebody needs to take in the role. And one of a really good simple heuristic to indicate smaller versus bigger roles is the time span from the point a decision is taken to the point where the last ripples of those decisions that decision has faded out. If you are, say, a manufacturing line in a factory, if you're leading the team in a manufacturing line, a decision that you take will probably have rippled out completely within a few days. Whereas if you are the CEO of a multinational like Unilever or Procter & Gamble, some of the decisions that you need to take will still have measurable outcomes 100 years later. And that is a much, much bigger role. And this is part of the reason why we're in such a mess today. People were taking decisions 50 years ago, lacking the capacity, the size of person necessary to really be able to see clearly how that decision would still be playing out 50 years later. And that does require a very high capacity in dialectic thinking, because nothing fits normal logic when you're trying to think 50 or 100 years into the future. Yeah. And time is one example of size of role, but other examples are things like the cultural spread of what you're working with, or the historical spread, or the generational spread. So much of what we're dealing with in today's world is simply a huge spread. Does that clarify, Mila? Does anybody else want to pick up on size of person, size of role before we move to Alex as the next one?
Thank you, Graham.
Right, then Alex, grand to see you again.
Yes, congratulations for the book. So I have two questions. First, well, I love it, everything to know that the dialectic thinking and the Kegan sense making, you put it in a book after so many years. I'm excited to read it or to listen to it. If you make the audiobook, I will ever prefer. And what I love most from your talk today is about the frame of reference and the context, you know, like this really can really change lives of people and companies by understanding and learning to, or maybe the distinction between reality and what you call actuality. I also love this distinction, but this whole process of how we receive information and sense making and meaning, it's so important. I love that you're making it accessible to many, many people, I hope. My two questions were, one, you talked about when we get expertise about something, we don't see it's under construction. So I got the main idea, but I would love if you could speak a bit more about that. Like, I understand that, for example, I do coaching for 10 years, so I understand quite well the coaching. I studied a lot, but probably I don't see what I don't know. And that's probably what you mean, but if you could speak more about that. And the other one is, you mentioned in the talk that we always underestimate the consequence of risk. And I was not clear about this statement. If you could also clarify for me, please.
Gladly, I will do both of those. So I'm going to start with the expertise. Now I'll get a little bit technical here for a moment, but bear with me. A moment ago, I talked about size of person as being the cognitive development line and the meaning-making line. Now, one of the names for a stage on the meaning-making life, it's called the expert stage. And somebody has reached the expert stage of meaning-making development, or somebody who has reached that stage, sees their self-identity and what it means to be them in the world as hardwired to their expertise. And they see their expertise as absolute. Now, somebody who is at that stage of meaning making cannot distinguish between having expertise and being an expert. The having and the being are hardwired together. And to progress to the next stage from the expert stage of meaning making requires, as a foundation, developing the capacity to use the thought form of everything is always under construction, including knowledge. Because if you can't use forms of thought around under construction, then you can't begin to take in to your conceptual reality generating world anything that throws into doubt your current knowledge, the expertise you have. And you see this all over the place. Jack has encountered it time and again amongst expert economists. They are being experts rather than having expertise. You find this in business leaders. You find this in coaches, consultants, everywhere. You find this in lawyers, doctors, so many of the issues that we run into with medical practitioners, with legal practitioners, lies in their self-identity being hardwired to being expert and being accepted as members of a closed and concretized club of experts. Does that tackle that one?
Yes.
Very, very clear. Yeah.
Jack.
Let me just add on a little bit, because the reason is I have to leave in just a minute, and the reason being is I'll be teaching in just a couple of minutes. But I do think this is also very, very critical, and this is something that we're wrestling with the discipline of economics. And I really appreciate your asking this, Alex. I would just simply have that. What we don't need experts, but what we need are people that can listen, that can dialogue, and realize that there's a lot more that we don't know than we know. And I would just end on that note and wish everybody a goodbye. I wish I did not have to leave. I do have to make a living. And I am teaching right now, but I'm also using this reading right now where I'm actually introducing a lecture on what to do about reducing emissions, global emissions. And this is a good basis. Well, I bid everybody goodbye. Nice to be with you, even just for a limited amount. I wish I didn't have to go, but if anybody would like to do my teaching right now, then I could stay with you and you could do my teaching. I would love it.
What's the topic?
It's looking at global warming emissions. Actually, just mention anything. Just any that, this will be on the exam, and you can talk about anything then. All right. Bye.
Thanks, Jack. Cheers.
Yeah, bye.
Right. So let me dive now into your next question, and I will just take Jack out for the moment. Right. So to your next question, it might be helpful. I won't go into the full detail of what I went into in the last webinar, but the thing is, the normal statistics that you learn.
The chance, can I just ask a question, because it's related to kind of the discussion points we had in the last question?
Okay, great. Then bring in your question, Misha, and I'll come back to your second question, Alex. Yeah,
I had kind of already had it on my mind, but then the last question kind of specified it even further. First of all, apologies to you, Graham. I haven't been in touch, but I mean, really very, very busy. As you know, we had Earth Day last week, and I was just swamped, and I'm sure I wasn't the only one. There was one webinar, conference, event after the other. I mean, at one point, I didn't know that I had that many devices. I was attending 4 conferences all at the same time. So as everybody knows, it's kind of looks very encouraging. At least the US is kind of saying like, look, let's not ignore it. Let's do something. And we all kind of know the politics. But the reason I bring it up as kind of a background. So again, it's very encouraging. And again, I found it fascinating, like others, that you made the distinction between reality and actuality. I always find it fascinating. And I think Italians say in their native language, mi realita, at least they acknowledge we all live in separate realities anyway, that even in the context of Earth Day and all these events, you could still see, and the reason I wanted to speak up now is, and actually I've been up since 5:30 in the morning because there were follow-up conferences, and particularly there was one by the IDDR. I mean, they were just smart people, one expert after the other, just unbelievable. And they talked about all the nuances, the details, the, hydrogen versus energy storage, whatever. Yet, but even among the experts, it's pretty obvious that as we're dealing with this kind of big issue with urgency.
I think I've frozen again.
I'm still okay. I'm still live. Are you okay?
think Graham's gone.
He is frozen again. He's very cold today. So in the meantime, assuming that I'm still on, I don't know whether he will hear the question, maybe others can join to it. My impression is, again, kind of like we have all these new goals, ambitions, and yet it's, again, all the experts talking, and hardly, to get to the core of my question, hardly anybody talks about, in terms of really get context, how do we relate to each other? Today, there will speak people from China, India, European Union, the US. We're all still separate, dealing kind of with a big, big issue. So I'm kind of like encouraged by us kind of bringing up the issue. But as somebody said, I think it was Graham before, there are 20 of us today on the webinar, 20. And last week at one of the events I was on, there were 24,000 people, but nobody talked about changing the way of thinking. So how do we actually kind of encourage it? It's not only the hard aspects, it's kind of not only the hardware, it's the software. That's my question. Whoever is still on. I mean, I'm still alive. Graham seems like he has frozen out, huh?
You're muted, Graham.
Thank you. I'm back in. I did freeze out for a while. I do apologize for that. I missed a few sentences in the middle of what you were saying, Misha, but I got the beginning and the end. So I think I've got the brackets on either side.
Okay.
So the one comment I'll put in is the intent that Jack and I have in writing the book is to make these things seen, at least, by people who would benefit from knowing that they exist, and hopefully sufficiently accessible that they can at least start to use them and improve. You know, for example, we can use that table of 28 thought forms in chapter 9 as a checklist when we're in conversation with people, and we can see, well, which forms of thought are we seeing showing up in this conversation? And if we highlight in green, for example, the forms of thought that are showing up strongly, we'll very quickly recognize the gaps where we're not seeing any form of thought. For example, we might very quickly recognize that we're in a tense conversation, a tense debate, let's say, and nobody at any point has shown any signals of recognizing the frames of reference that each person is using. And so if we're then in that conversation and we recognize that, we now have the opportunity of saying, you know, hang on a minute, let's take a look at the frames of reference, or whatever is the appropriate name to use at that point. Which means that one of the things that I would really love is if any of you have contact with people who would benefit from knowing that the book exists, from reading the book, please introduce them to it. You know, put reviews onto Goodread or Amazon or anything like that, again, so that people who would benefit from knowing that this book exists actually have a chance to know that it exists. That would be, I think, very helpful. And it's one of your favorite themes, Misha, that I'm very much in support of, and is part of why we wrote a book that basically spanned everything from individual development through to transforming the planetary economy and ecosystems and ecology as one book, is recognizing that so many of the problems we have are because echo chambers of experts talk to each other and maybe talk at each other, but they very, very seldom really come together and engage in a true dialogue of really trying to understand each other's inner reality, how it's constructed, and the benefits of that. You know, as Jack and I write in the book, economists of the future will have to be deep experts in adult development and the social sciences. You can't do good economics if you don't really understand people. Yeah, and that's one example of the need to come together.
Yeah, just to give you a final flavor, again, I mentioned there were so many kind of events last week. I don't know whether any of you kind of knew about it, participated. There was one actually out of Toronto called Collision. I mean, it was so well organized, very, very professional, really high caliber people, whatever. But the impression I gained is they basically went on for 3 days, I think either 10 or 15 minutes, another group of experts, another group of experts. And by the end, I was left like, on the one hand, like, wow. On the other hand, it was very clear. There was one group after the other producing, let's call, use the technical equivalent, producing a pixel. And yet nobody was looking at the whole picture. I mean, it was just fascinating. Again, it's in terms of the way of thinking, there was not one single group who focused on like, oh, maybe we kind of look at all this from a different perspective. Again, it was the emphasis on the hardware, the hard thinking, and not kind of like the different one. But again, I just wanted to share the feedback, and I certainly take your encouragement to heart in terms of, even so we're just, by now I think we're only we're 18 of us. Again, if each and every one of us keeps on spreading the word, maybe we can kind of encourage others to see the world differently.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Misha. Yeah, and one thing I'll just throw in, Nikki Gularia, who created the artwork for the book, she's created artwork that is based on the style of Picasso, both his sort of newspaper collage style and his painted style. And that reflects a key message of the book, that we really need to look at everything in its entirety and how it all comes together. And that cannot be done from one single privileged perspective. You need multiple perspectives to do it. Just as Picasso said, you know, if I want to paint a horse, it's not enough to just paint a thing that looks like the left side of a horse. I'm trying to paint horseness as I conceive of horseness in my thoughts. And that reflects also the original title of the book was Picasso and Einstein, The Economy, Leadership, and You. So again, this reflects what Misha has been saying, the need to really make visible on one place the relatedness between different disciplines, fields, concepts, people that are currently treated as widely separated. So I will come back and say a couple of things about Alex's other question. Are we right? So my connection seems to have broken again.
Yeah, he's again frozen.
I think your screen freezes, but we can hear you.
Right.
We can see you now.
I'm back again. Good,
We
good.
hear you speaking. It's just that your picture freezes.
Yes. No, that's good to know that you hear me speaking. Then I'll keep speaking.
Yeah, I think you can just carry on, and then if it gets bad, then I'll give you a tinkle.
Yes, goody good. I had a warning message pop up that my internet is unstable. Nothing I can do about it. I have a wired connection, so it's not Wi-Fi contention. So picking up briefly on your other question, Alex, and as I say, have a look at the video that's it's on our YouTube channel, and we'll be putting it into our website tomorrow or the day after. But the essence of it is, at school, we learn that to work out whether it's a good decision or a bad decision, we add up all of the probabilities of winning and all of the probabilities of losing. And if the average is positive, then it's a good gamble to take, and we go with it. Unfortunately, almost everything in business and everything in each individual person's life doesn't work that way. Instead of adding things up and taking the average of the probability, if you take something in your life, you have one event after another. And so what happens second is connected to what happens first. Because of the connectedness or the relationship between events in life or events in business, you have to use statistically multiplicative statistics, not additive statistics. School additive statistics only works if there is no relationship between things. As soon as it's one life or one business, there is automatically a relationship that is hardwired in. And where that leads to is, for example, if the same decisions disconnected would on average give you a 5% win, happen in a connected sequence, it leads to 5% loss. And so much of investment is actually poor decisions because it's using disconnected portfolio statistics when actually it's a connected sequence. And the thesis we have is that a big reason why investors are after unicorns is simply because of a misapplication of statistics, using statistics that are actually invalid. And that's one of the reasons we point at in the book why things like modern portfolio theory are actually even more broken than most people think. Right. I see Kilo, your hand is up. Let's go with you first, Kilo, and then Ben.
Thank you. And very thought-provoking, really love it. I hope I can be articulate about it, so I apologize in advance. But so I'm wondering now, as we're looking at these forms of thought and these different frameworks and, you know, how we think about the world, how we hold the world, whether speaking about thinking is even enough. And where I'm coming from is the importance of our states of being. And so even if we say the same thought or the same way of thinking and holding the world, if we say it from a different state, our impact on people is very different. And politicians, you know, actors and such are quite masterful at playing with our states and then adding a message to that, whether you call that thinking or not. And so it's easy to speak about emotional states and our impact on each other from that. If I say the same thing in anger and aggression or awe or enthusiasm or, you know, deep peace, it has a different impact in what it elicits in you and even in how you hear what you say. And so the other part, maybe a little more intriguing and less spoken about, is things like, and, you know, people may be of mixed and different minds, but it's interesting to look at this notion of David Hawkins' table of levels of consciousness, if you will, which really comes more to the states of our being. What is our frequency when we speak? When I speak to a dog, I may speak one way. I don't want to speak to my boss the same way, and I don't want to speak to my boss as I would speak to my sweetheart or professor necessarily either, right? These states of being, where we come from, and the underlying, you know, am I a fearful person? Am I a wide open person? It carries information differently in addition to the verbalized words. And while it may seem more tenable to teach people how to think, the size of person type, how to think, seems to have a lot to do with how broadly we are able to hold the world from these different levels of consciousness. I don't know if that makes sense or if that's a reasonably articulated question, but, you know, for example, academic professors do not use different states of being enough when given the importance of what they have figured out in their expertise. And I'm trained as a scientist, and speaking from that experience, even though I now work in financing innovation, speaking from a different level of state of being experience. And we impact each other a lot by where we come from, not just how we think or analyze. And I'm just wondering if there's even a place for that in this discussion, or does this feel too nebulous? Regardless of whether it feels nebulous, it's probably much more impactful than in the general cultural narrative and, you know, landscape of how we think and how we hold the world is given credit to. So that's a kind of rambly question.
Thank you, Kilo. I found that question very, very clear, at least to me. And I promise everybody, I didn't ask Kilo to ask this question. I didn't set her up for this. However, it points at one of the other key themes in the book that we haven't yet talked about, and that we will schedule in a couple of months' time in the sequence. But in the book on page 152, there's a diagram that looks like that. And that is a yin-yang diagram that shows three elements: the sense-making, the meaning-making, which is what we've touched on, and the hardwired nature. And within hardwired nature, we're also getting at what Kilo's pointing at in the state. Things that are neither sense-making nor meaning-making, but influence what you can do with sense-making and meaning-making, and are influenced back by them. So, for example, I might have a hardwired nature that leads me to react with very strong emotions to anything that happens. Somebody else might have a hardwired nature that leads them to have almost no emotional reaction regardless of what happens. Now, if somebody is a brain surgeon, you actually want a brain surgeon that has almost no emotional reaction, no matter how extreme the situation is. You want their hand and their thinking to remain as clear and steady when you're on the edge of death as when they are completely relaxed at a barbecue. Whereas if you're dealing with in a situation where it's vitally important to be really, really sensitive to the subtle nuances of what is happening in the group, you actually want somebody who has a high emotional amplitude, who can really feel into what's happening. And so what you're saying, Kilo, is absolutely essential. The model where I was talking about the two sides of person, there is the third dimension of state, and that's not directly, some of that state is hardwired, so it's not developmental, it's not something that you can change, and some of it is soft-wired. You can change it. For instance, you can learn to take more distance from your feelings. You can learn to become comfortable inhabiting states, emotions that you learned to avoid when you were growing up. And it's really important in the sense that, as you were saying, human beings are very strongly emotional, and we have superb equipment to pick up the emotions of other people. And if somebody says something to me from a state of anger, I will react completely differently to the same person saying the same words from a state of joy. Does that adequately address what you were pointing at, Kilo?
Yes, thank you. Love the third axis. I'll be walking with that.
Grand. So, Ben, shall we dive into what you have? And I appreciate your patience bearing with me with your hand in the air for a while.
No worries, Graham. Thank you. And I think my question parallels a lot of what Kilu and Michelle mentioned earlier. So I hope this isn't too redundant, but with these thought forms, what I notice is there's so many parallels to either religious thinking or spiritual thinking, I mean, permanent movement and the constant state of change, very, very much Buddhist principle. There's kind of the mystics of the Abrahamic, it's just all spread throughout. And, what I find, I guess my question is, that resonation, I feel like often comes from seekers, people, there's that willingness to seek, to explore. And so thinking about how this translates to teams or at a larger scale organizations or even larger scale society as a whole. You know, if we want to make progress in terms of kind of bringing these thought forms into higher planes of awareness and consciousness within ourselves or teams, you know, what are some of the more practical applications of beginning this work with others and of course with oneself?
Beautiful question. Again, I could not have asked for a more helpful hook to hang on something else that I wanted to bring into here. So where you started is absolutely spot on. These thought forms will be familiar to anybody who is versed in any or a number of the old traditions or religions or spiritual bodies of work. These 28 thought forms originated in a group of philosophers in Frankfurt who started to recognize that there were common forms of thought across all of the philosophical traditions, spiritual traditions, and that you could abstract the form of thought from the content within each of the traditions. And that if you abstracted the form of thought, you could then use it and learn it far more effectively and put it into use easily without needing to first learn an entire content of thought and then through some inner intuitive way recognize that the content was distinct from the form. And by the way, that is one of the thought forms, is recognizing the difference between a form or an essence and a specific concretization. So when I talk about our Fair Shares Commons incorporation, I, as often as I can, point out that the Fair Shares Commons is really a form of incorporation that admits multiple different concretizations. And the one that I happen to be using to point at the form is just one concretization, and I'm using it to point. So that then leads on to the second part of what you were asking, which is, first of all, the fact that these 28 thought forms exist as a table in a book is the outcome of a century of work taking out the content to leave just the pure form, and then repackaging it, in particular by Otto Lasker, repackaging it so that it can really be used in a business context without any need to go into any spiritual tradition or anything like that. And so to make it really easy is, if one person in a leadership team starts to get some familiarity with these forms of thought, that person will begin to recognize when there is a gap in the forms of thought that are being used in a leadership team or in a company or in a startup or whatever, and can begin to introduce it. As soon as a second person is starting to become familiar with them, the two of them can now form a learning pair. They can spend an hour a week in dialogue with each other, consciously exploring how to use one form of thought and another. And so there's a huge scope to use the book as a DIY kit for self-development, simply taking the thought forms and working through the 28 in succession. You know, I used to do this 10 years ago when I started diving into this. I would do it on a monthly cycle. Every day I would take one of the thought forms and I would work through all 28, take a few days break from thought form practice, and then start again the next month. And you know, one of the triggers of that was, oh, and you can also get a professional assessment of exactly which thought forms are you fluid in, which ones are you not using at all, and which thought forms are at the edge of your range. With a bit of support, you can use it, but you can't use it alone, in particular, not in a heated dialogue. So with that kind of assessment, it then opens up space, for example, to hire a professional coach to coach you in the use of these thought forms. And of course, we offer workshops that focus in on using these thought forms, where it's a facilitated dialogue, where the participants are in dialogue with each other to practice using them with a guide who is hopefully more fluid in the thought forms than the participants are, to guide you into using them more effectively. Now, I'll put as a side comment, this is one of the misconceptions in coaching, that a coach can coach anybody. And I put this in as a caution. If you're being coached by a coach who has less fluidity in the thought forms that you have, that coach cannot understand what you are trying to say as soon as you are reaching the limits of your developmental level, or as soon as you've passed their dialectic developmental level. And equally, if you're being coached by somebody whose stage of meaning making is at a smaller stage than yours, they are likely to try to pull you back to the stage of meaning making that you have just fought really hard to leave, rather than support you in growing even bigger. So it's really important to be cautious who you choose as a coach. And if you are coaching somebody, to be very aware of whether you're coaching somebody who is smaller in size of person than you are, about as big as you are, or they might be bigger. Does that address your question, Ben?
Yes, thank you, Graham. I found it on Teams when you can have those conversations. It's just so powerful. It's just sometimes it doesn't spread to the whole team or group. It may just be isolated incidents, and I've seen that cause struggles, but
yes,
very helpful start. Thank you.
And you've put your finger on something that we also touch on in the book, and I'll talk about that. Teams that are divided or undivided. The typical team has members that have a spread both of size of person in sense making and size of person in meaning making. And typically you'll have the bulk of the team at a center of gravity and one or two people who are either higher or lower. If you have a team where only one or two people are bigger than the center of gravity, you have an upwardly divided team. If you have one or two people who are lower, you have a downwardly divided team. And the big question then is the team dynamic one where the center of gravity pulls the more developed person, the higher size of person, down? Or is the person who has the highest center of gravity in a position of power where they can pull the whole team up? And in a divided team like that, it's very easy to run into conflict where nobody understands what's causing the conflict. But the conflict is coming about simply because part of the team has a much bigger size of person and is able to really grasp actuality in a far more realistic and nuanced way, and the other part cannot. So there are all types of dysfunctions that come about when you have a divided team.
Thank you, Graham.
Right. Who else would like to throw something in? We have 10 minutes before the formal end of the meeting, but I'm happy to stay in longer for anybody who wants to stay in longer. Equally, I know that some people have a busy day ahead of them and other people have a busy day behind them. Marie, is that a question, or are you saying hello, or are you drowning? And I'm drowning, not waving.
No, I was just saying bye to Stephanie because she just said in the chat she's leaving.
All right. Cheers, Stephanie. Thank you for being with us.
Cheers. Thanks a lot for today and all the great questions.
Yes.
Bye.
And if you want to know more about our developmental workshops, contact Stephanie. She's the person who's mainly leading our Adaptive Way workshops.
Yeah, but Mary has the logistics, so she's also very useful.
Yes, exactly.
Bye.
So both Marie and Stephanie are two extraordinarily powerful colleagues in this adventure that we're on.
Thank you.
Great. So, Nicholas.
Yeah, I got a question because we're all talking about the open mind and the open-minded people and so on, and I must say we're pretty much confronted with people that are not in this position. I don't even want to talk about the toxic profiles where we could even organize a webinar just for these extreme people, but okay, I don't want to spend too much time on that. No, I was just thinking about the role system we're living in, where I must say we are working in a system where meritocracy is really at the heart of everything we're doing. And for me, it is clear that it has led people to specialization and expertise to the extent that it is clearly your idea. That's my identity, and I'm going to talk for myself. I'm a consultant coach, like Ben and many people here. And whenever you have to introduce yourself, the question is always the same: is what's your domain of expertise? And it's really like the definition of who I am that is being led in this conversation, and it is clearly expected from the counterpart. And whenever you would say that I have known, I'm kind of, I embrace the world, I embrace life, I'm an open-minded person, I'm ready to talk about anything. Let's go and jump for a conversation. You're being seen like a freak, clearly. And I think that we're now confronted with society that is really not really ready for this. I'm really enjoy this discussion because you've got the feeling like, hey, I'm not the only one here. Yeah, I love it so much. Yeah, but whenever you talk, I'm going to share an experience with you. My profession is really to work with businesses to help them for any type of transformation. And whenever you lead transformation, well, the core of your activity is the transformation in itself. Yeah. I went to a Belgian hospital. I'm going to say Belgian because I don't want to generalize. I'm just going to be specific. I'm going to talk about Belgium. Yeah. So Belgian hospital. I went in and the guy asked me that very specific question. Have you had experience with other hospitals in transformation? And this is it. That's the killing question. Yes, I had, but being asked this question send this image to me that, so I have to show that I have done this before, that I'm expert into this to show that you're capable of doing something. So this is really your identity. This is who you are. And well, I just wanted to throw this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. And it's an extraordinarily relevant point in today's age. In the model we use for development along the meaning-making axis, and I'll stress this is one of many models. Each model has common ground and differences. This is one that I find the cleanest to use. The one stage is called the socialized mind stage, stage 3. And that's where people derive their self-identity and all of their meaning making is anchored in constructing their identity and their meaning by internalizing the norms of the group that they belong to. And from the research that has been done that I've seen, 55% of the human population never progresses beyond stage 3 or a little bit beyond. And this is and at this stage, you cannot create your identity other than through the groups you belong to. And so in today's world, the dominant group that many of us belong to is our working group and the kind of peers and colleagues that we have in our working group. And the thing is that I tend to ask people, what do you do? And I hope that they will answer and say, I do. But so often I ask, what do you do? And I get back the reply, I am, insert your professional title here. And that is for me immediately an indication that I'm probably talking to somebody who's around about stage 3. Possibly at the halfway stage between stage 3 and stage 4. So the halfway point is what's called the expert stage that I was pointing at previously. Stage 4 is the point where people completely separate their identity from belonging to any specific group. Stage 4 is the stage where people say, I am me. I am authentic and I have constructed my own integrity and my own authenticity, in the framework that I'm using. And the sad part of it is only around 20–25% of people ever get to stage 4. But that's the first stage that has decoupled their self-identity from belonging to a group, which means it's the first stage that actually sees themselves and other people as fully distinct human beings, and the first stage that can actually truly begin to manage other people, which was fine 100 years ago where we didn't need many managers. But in today's world where we need a lot of managers and leaders, part of the issue we're running into is the number of people who are in a leadership role who are somewhere between stage 3 and stage 4. So they construct their self-identity, their self-worth, their meaning from other people. And that means that their very identity, their very right to exist is other dependent. And for these people, criticism, other opinions, other perspectives, dialogue with people from completely different disciplines or cultures can very easily become existentially threatening. It's, am I okay as a person is what's running through them. And so this is something where it's a huge part of what we're wrestling with now. I see your hand is up, Misha, and I'll come to you in a moment, but seeing your hand going up has brought to mind, this is one of the forces that holds groups of people who really need to be interacting with each other back from coming into relationship. Coming into relationship brings in existential threats around identity. So yeah, to make it work, basically we need to have more people who recognize what's happening and who can engage as facilitators, bridge builders, brokers, and gently help people to recognize what's happening and progress beyond it. Misha.
Yeah, you used the term sad before. Now, I usually try to finish on a positive note, but maybe kind of question to you or kind of the group we're still on. When it comes to this kind of thinking, stage 3, 4, whatever, it's like, as a society, we have an amazing opportunity right now, but it seems like we're still missing it. And again, what other challenges do we need to find out? What I'm talking about is, I mentioned Earth Day, all the events last week, and at the same time, hey, we're still having COVID. The reason I bring it up is I'm in the Bay Area in California. And in the meantime, we have a situation where certain counties, and by the way, even within the Bay Area, there are the differences. I live in Marin, the wealthiest county. We have already 2/3 of people vaccinated. And in certain states, they have 14,000 vaccines per week and 420 people show up. At the same time, we know the situation in India. Nobody talks about South America. And it's interesting when you talked earlier about identities, am I okay? Everybody here is again saying like, well, as long as I get the shot, even so it's pretty obvious that delaying the vaccination for a, whatever, 18-year-old here is probably kind of would be more worthwhile. And I just heard from a friend in Europe where his 88-year-old mother is still not being vaccinated. And in the meantime, everybody gets it at 16. And it's absolutely stunning to see the world having, we call it a global pandemic, still operating on a nation state by nation state basis. Oh, we're shipping some vaccines now to where it's really kind of the worst, and so on and so on. It's absolutely astonishing. So I kind of said before, I don't want to repeat myself, but just to stress it, I don't want to be sad in disillusion, but I just find it still astonishing that when we as humankind get this global opportunity to really understand that the solution is really a, whatever you want to call it now, holistic, comprehensive, relational one, it doesn't make sense to have America first vaccinated and then of the rest of the world just going down the drain. So, and you still hardly hear, I mean, despite all the best efforts in the meantime here and there, that anybody kind of stresses that, look, the solution is really, it's all of us. I mean, the herd immunity, I mean, the virus doesn't, it's stunning that we have the so-called virus, which is not even by definition, according to life sciences, a living organism. And yet the virus thinks and acts globally, and we as humans, enlightened as we are kind of just, we're not operating locally, whatever, on a totally selfish basis. So I just contradict myself. It doesn't sound like a positive closing, but I think that one day we can look back and say like, what an opportunity to learn. We missed the lesson, but we better do apply kind of the lessons for the future, because that's not the last challenges we're going to have in this respect. So I just wanted to add to it, because I found it almost enlightening that we're one of the few discussion groups which hardly talks about it, kind of COVID still happening, but just wanted to add to it. And I hope, I mean, it was still a mostly constructive rather than pessimistic statement. And I appreciate everybody's time and looking forward to further discussions.
I would love to throw in a couple of thoughts building on what you've just said. So first of all, I will pick up on the transformation thought forms. What is hopeful, the value of conflict, in particular conflict that can lead to development, and precisely the kind of stress that we're in globally now has huge potential to generate the kind of global development that we're talking about. So that's the first thing I'll put in. And in that sense, I will also point at, where am I? Sorry, I just need to get myself up to there. Yeah, you're also touching on the frames of reference. Each different country is using a different frame of reference. We're using different frames of reference. The situation we're in, again, is one where there's a big gap in people's capacity to use dialectic thinking, to use multiple frames of reference to really get a better handle on what's happening, to triangulate from multiple realities onto a better understanding of actuality. And in particular, one of the things that's missing is use of R1, relationship thought form 1, even an awareness of the relatedness. The catastrophic growth of COVID in India and in Brazil is creating the perfect arena for the virus to grow and mutate. And the probability that we will get variants emerging from these countries that are completely or untouched or only weakly touched by the vaccines we currently have is high. And you see this complete lack of understanding of existence of relationships or capacity to work with multiple open systems in balance in the fact that so many people and countries were surprised when when COVID-19 arrived. I myself was not at all surprised. I've just been waiting for this to arrive. I was in China when SARS coronavirus 1 emerged in 2002, 2003. And I looked at the MERS virus, which was the next big potential coronavirus pandemic. And it was perfectly clear to me, this is going to come. It's just a matter of time before the next one arrives and goes global. And I find it, I'm flabbergasted at how many countries coming out of the 2002 SARS-CoV-1 and out of the MERS virus had early warning systems in place, had action plans in place, knew what to do, and then either did not do it, or in some countries had actually dismantled their early warning systems, had shut down their response unit, and so didn't have any more in place what was needed. And for me, one big part of that is just the lack of capacity in too many people who are in leadership positions to use the different thought forms effectively. Right. We have been running for a good 90 minutes, and I know everybody is on a tight, or some people are on a tight schedule. Any last question or comment before we bring the meeting to a close? And there's absolutely no compulsion to stay here. If you are on a tight schedule and need to hop off, you are more than welcome to.
Well, as usual, I have another suggestion, another thought is, at the end of a busy week after all the impact environmental events, I attended, as you know, I've been fairly active in kind of like the fintech, blockchain space, just trying to understand what's happening. Anyway, to get to a point, there was a conference by Wharton Business School last Thursday, Friday, and it was actually organized by the student groups. So the pitch events were all kind of by students. And to get to the core of my question, where on the one hand, I was impressed in terms of how many ideas there are. I was almost shocked in terms of how everybody was, again, thinking about, wow, how do I make this the next big, unicorn, whatever, all kind of what's in for me. What I'm talking about is just seeing this young generation. Even there's this lack of, let's just work on all this together. Even so, in particular in the blockchain space, they still talk about, oh, we're changing things, we're democratizing, we're decentralizing, we're cooperating, yet it's not happening. And I followed up with a couple of people and say like, well, is anybody as part of the MBA program teaching about this kind of different way of thinking? Zero. I always kind of say like, I notice with a few exceptions, most of us kind of, I notice in these groups, usually we're middle-aged, we have done it a certain way, we realize it doesn't work. And yet we don't necessarily kind of work enough, in my opinion, with the young generation. Why do they have to find out that, again, it doesn't work? Let's really focus with a new one. So my hope is, as a comment, is that we somehow kind of find a way to engage more of the young generation in terms of the different way of thinking and organizing.
Yes, absolutely. It's essential to do that. And that's a big part of our focus in Evolute 6. We've got Gareth and Daniil here from Solve Earth, who are our close collaborators and who are also Fair Shares Commons Incorporated. And they're even more focused on the younger generation than we are. So there is movement in that space. And Marius, yourself in Denmark, we still need to have that conversation, but I'm gathering that you're also more in that realm. So I think that there's a huge need. There might not be, in some cases, sufficient awareness for it to be a conscious want, but it's something that I'm really keen to do. And one of the MVPs that I ran at the beginning of this journey, so unlike the normal way of doing the stuff that's in the book, which is highly coach-oriented, training-oriented, very much in an expert paradigm, our paradigm is to do this in peer-to-peer dialogue. And from the basis of learn how to do it badly and then do it badly with your peers. And by doing it badly with each other, you'll slowly get better and better. And as one of our mantras in our programs is, it's far better to do it badly today than to try to do it perfectly tomorrow. And one of the big pieces of encouragement in the first MVP I ran, one of the participants was at that stage a 15-year-old girl. And at the end of it, she came up to me and said, Graham, this was fantastic. I was able to use everything that you were giving us. Okay, she wasn't maybe using it in the same way as somebody else was using it, but she was able to use everything in dialogue. And she said at the end, Graham, this was fantastic. I think it's the first time that I've really felt listened to and understood by people who were quite different to me. And for me, that was real validation that even though some of these things are enormously powerful and sophisticated, you can put them into patterned dialogue that enables all ages to benefit from, all ages to use, and we can create a developmental conveyor belt that will get lots and lots of people to develop. And that was the big intent here. Do it as a peer-to-peer process that doesn't need an expert around, because there's no way we can get 1 billion people on the planet growing the way we need in the next 10 years if we're dependent on one-on-one coach-coachee hierarchical relationships. It has to be peer-to-peer DIY relationships. Then I would say, let us slowly wrap this up. I am thrilled at everybody who has been in this meeting. I do encourage you to head over to the website. Oh, I didn't do it before we came into this meeting. I will do it immediately afterwards, and put in the registration for the next webinar at the end of next month. And if you want to dive deeper into any of these, on our programs page are links to the various lists that we are establishing for people who are interested in signing up. And as soon as we have enough participants, we will schedule one of the programs. So if any of that intrigues, feel free. And if you have any questions, bounce them my way. You have my LinkedIn details up at the top there. And also reach out to any of my colleagues. The Ask Evolute 6 email address works, etc. Lots of ways of reaching me. Right. Thank you, everybody. This has been fantastic. Really enjoyed having you all here, and thrilled that so many of you stayed 15 minutes longer than the scheduled end. Much appreciated.
Usually it was worth it. Vielen, vielen Dank.
Excellent. Thank you, Misha.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you all. Good to see you all here.
Thank you.
Graham?
Thanks, folks.
Can I
Bye-bye.
just-
See you later.
Yes.
Graham, can I
Au
just
revoir.
ask-